34 years, 364 days, one single day away from everything he earned towned, and they were about to take it all in 4 minutes. One day before his pension vested. One day. And they called it restructuring. Everyone thought he was calling for comfort. He was calling to finish what he started 3 years ago. For 3 years, he documented every falsified record, every buried accident, every stolen dollar terror, waiting for the one moment it would matter most. They tried to erase 35 years in 4 minutes. His one phone call brought the whole thing crashing down instead.
If you have ever felt invisible after giving everything you had to someone who owed you better, stay until the end of this video, because what this man did with his very last phone call will change the way you look at loyalty, patience, and quiet justice forever. Before we begin, if stories about real courage and real consequences move you, hit that like button and subscribe, because this channel exists for people like you who still believe good things happen to good people who wait long enough for the truth to surface. Robert Callahan was 62 years old, and for 34 years, 408 days short of what would have been 35, he had walked through the same steel gate at Harrow Industrial Manufacturing at exactly 6:45 in the morning. He knew the sound of every machine on the floor the way a father knows the different cries of his children. He knew which press groaned before it needed oil, which conveyor belt stuttered on cold mornings, which forklift driver liked his coffee black, and which one liked it sweet. He had trained 11 supervisors who now sat in offices he was never invited into. He had covered night shifts when his daughter had chickenpox, working 16-hour days so she would never know what it felt like to go without. He had buried his wife Eleanor when Grace was only 7, and he had raised that little girl alone in a 2-bedroom house on Maple Court, packing her lunches every single morning for 11 straight years without missing a single day, even the day of Eleanor's funeral, because he had promised himself that grief would never touch his daughter's stomach the way it touched his heart. Grace was 29 now. She had grown into a sharp, quietly fierce young woman who worked as a financial compliance investigator for the state attorney general's office, the kind of job that required patience, precision, and an almost unnatural ability to notice when numbers were lying. She rarely spoke about her cases. Robert rarely asked. Their relationship had always worked that way, two people who loved each other so deeply that words sometimes felt unnecessary, replaced instead by Sunday dinners, silent car rides that meant more than any conversation, and the unspoken understanding that whatever happened, they had each other. The house on Maple Court still smelled faintly of Eleanor if you walked in at just the right hour of the evening, when the light hit the kitchen window the way it used to when she was alive, humming while she cooked, teasing Robert for coming home with grease under his fingernails no amount of scrubbing could fully remove. Robert never remarried. Friends at the plant used to ask him why, gently, over cold coffee in the break room, and he always gave the same answer. I already found the only one I was looking for. Now I've got a second job, making sure her daughter never doubts she was loved twice as hard to make up the difference. He meant it literally. He worked doubles when Grace needed braces. He sold his motorcycle, the one thing he had ever bought purely for himself, to pay for her school trip to the state capitol in 8th grade, and told her it broke down and wasn't worth fixing so she would never feel guilty about it. He learned to braid hair from a library book because Eleanor used to be the one who did it, and he refused to let his daughter go to school with her hair undone just because grief had rearranged their family. Grace never knew about the motorcycle until she found the sale receipt, folded and yellowing, inside his old wallet. 17 years later, on the same day everything else in this story began to unfold. She had cried in her car in the Harrow parking lot for 10 minutes before she could even start the engine. At the plant, Robert had earned a reputation that had nothing to do with titles and everything to do with trust. Young hires were quietly told by the older machinists, almost like a rite of passage, if Cal tells you a machine's not safe, you don't run it, no matter what the schedule says. He had pulled 2 men out from under a jammed conveyor with his bare hands in 2009, tearing a rotator cuff. He never bothered getting properly treated because the insurance deductible would have cut into Grace's college fund. He trained supervisors who eventually outranked him, shook their hands with genuine pride when they got promoted, and never once asked why the promotions never seemed to come his own way. He simply assumed, the way steady men often do, that showing up and doing the job right was its own quiet promise the world would eventually keep. He was wrong about that for 34 years, 364 days. He just didn't know it yet. Retirement was one day away. 35 years at Harrow would have unlocked Robert's full pension, health coverage that would carry Eleanor's old medical debts off his shoulders forever, and a small gold watch the company gave to men who gave their lives to the factory floor. He had a countdown taped inside his locker. 365 days had turned into one. He had already told his coworkers he would bring donuts on his last morning. He had already imagined 100 times walking out of that gate as a free man, his daughter waiting in the parking lot with a bottle of champagne neither of them could really afford but would drink anyway. Then Derek Voss happened. Derek had been installed 6 months earlier as the new regional operations vice president, flown in from corporate headquarters with a Harvard MBA, a tailored Navy suit that had never once seen sawdust, and a spreadsheet mentality that treated 34 years of loyalty as a line item to be optimized away. Derek had discovered, buried in the fine print of the pension restructuring memo he himself had quietly pushed through the board 6 weeks earlier, that any employee terminated even one day before their 35th anniversary would forfeit the entire final tier pension bump, saving the company nearly $210,000 per affected worker over their expected lifetime. Robert was not the only name on that list. He was simply the closest to the deadline, which made him, in Derek's private notes, Priority 1. Derek had never once walked the factory floor without a clipboard and a visible sense of impatience. The kind of man who measured a room's value in square footage and overhead, rather than the decades of muscle memory it took to run a press safely. He had reviewed personnel files the way other men reviewed grocery receipts, looking only for what could be trimmed. When his assistant, a nervous young HR coordinator named Marcus, who would later quietly regret his own small role in all of it, flagged that 17 employees across the region were within 1 year of full pension vesting, Derek didn't see 17 careers. He saw 17 numbers that, added together, represented enough projected savings to make his first-year performance review look extraordinary to the people above him, who had hired him specifically to tighten operations. Robert Callahan's file sat at the very top of that list, not because he was the most expensive, but because his vesting date, 365 days out when the memo was drafted, had ticked down to almost nothing, making him the cleanest, quickest cut to execute before anyone above Derek asked too many questions about the pattern forming underneath his numbers. On a gray Thursday morning, with rain tapping softly against the corrugated roof of the plant, Robert was called into the small glass-walled office near the loading dock. He noticed, walking in, that the blinds had been drawn halfway, just enough to keep the floor from watching too closely. Derek sat behind the desk with a folder he had clearly rehearsed opening, his tie a shade too bright for the gray morning outside, a fresh cup of coffee steaming beside him that he never once offered to share, an old habit of Robert's own kitchen manners that made the omission feel almost deliberately cold. He used words like restructuring initiative and workforce optimization, and regretfully effective immediately. He never once used the word fired, as if avoiding the word could soften what it did to a man's chest. He mentioned a severance package that, on paper, sounded generous to anyone who hadn't done the math Robert had already done in his head 100 times over the past year, calculating exactly what one single day of vesting was worth to a man who had planned his entire retirement, and Eleanor's outstanding medical bills around that number. Robert sat there, 34 years and 364 days of his life summarized in a 4-minute meeting, and felt something inside him go very, very quiet. He did not shout, he did not beg. He had spent his whole life being the steady one, the man other men called when their machines broke or their marriages did, and some habits do not disappear even when the floor falls out from under you. He simply asked one question. Is this because I'm 1 day away from vesting? Derek's silence answered more honestly than his mouth ever could. Robert nodded slowly, stood up, shook the younger man's hand out of pure muscle memory, and walked back onto the factory floor for what he believed would be the last time. His coworkers watched him clean out his locker. Big Tomas, who had worked beside him for 22 years, offered to march into corporate and raise hell. Priya from the packing line cried without trying to hide it. Robert told them all the same thing, calm as still water. Don't make trouble on my account. I've still got one call to make. Nobody understood what he meant. They assumed he meant a lawyer or his daughter or maybe just his own tired heart needing somewhere to land. He walked to the small break room at the back of the plant, sat down on the same bench he had eaten 10,000 lunches on, and dialed a number he had saved in his phone under a name that meant nothing to anyone but him. "Gee, emergency only." Grace picked up on the second ring, her voice already sharpening the way it did whenever her father called during work hours, because in 29 years he had used that particular tone perhaps 3 times in her whole life. "Dad, what's wrong?" "They let me go, sweetheart," he said, his voice steady in a way that broke her heart more than tears would have. "1 day short. Vesting clause. Voss did it on purpose." There was a pause on the line, and when Grace spoke again, something in her voice had shifted from daughter to investigator, though the love never left it. "Dad, listen to me carefully. The files. The ones you've been sending me every quarter for the last 3 years. The maintenance logs, the safety overrides, the shift reports Voss's team has been forging to hide the press failures on line 4. Do you still have copies?" Robert allowed himself, for the first time that day, something close to a smile. Because what nobody at Harrow Industrial ever knew, not Derek, not the regional board, not even most of Robert's own co-workers, was that quiet, steady Robert Callahan had spent the last 3 years documenting something far bigger than his own pension. It had started small, almost by accident, back when a safety inspector named Hollis, a friend of 30 years who had since retired and moved out of state, quietly mentioned over coffee that his final report on Line 4's hydraulic seals had come back from corporate cleaned up before it ever reached the county file, with the most serious wear findings simply deleted. Hollis hadn't wanted trouble. He was months from his own retirement, and said so apologetically, the way tired men do when they've decided a fight isn't theirs to finish. But he left Robert with one sentence that never stopped echoing in his head. "Somebody ought to keep a copy of the real one, Cal, just in case." Robert did more than keep a copy. Over the following 3 years, quietly, methodically, the same way he approached everything in his life, he began noticing patterns nobody else on the floor had the patience or the access to piece together. Safety inspection reports on the aging line. 4 hydraulic presses were being altered after real inspections flagged dangerous wear on the pressure seals. 2 near-miss accidents, one involving a 19-year-old new hire named Dwayne, who narrowly avoided losing 3 fingers when a seal partially failed under pressure, were buried in informal incident logs that never reached OSHA the way federal law required. Invoices for critical safety parts were approved, paid for, and never actually installed on the machines they were meant to protect. The money instead quietly routed through a shell maintenance contractor that, as it eventually turned out, was 18% owned by a cousin of the previous regional VP, a detail so brazen it almost seemed designed to be found by someone who never came looking. Robert hadn't gone to the police, he hadn't gone to the press. Both options terrified him more than staying silent, not because he lacked courage, but because he understood, with the clear-eyed practicality of a man who had raised a daughter alone on a factory wage, that a single accusation, without proof, would simply get him fired on the spot, discredited and quietly replaced, while the real danger to men like Tomas and Priya and young Dwayne would keep right on ticking, unrepaired, underneath a fresh coat of corporate paint. So instead, he had done what a careful, steady man does. He photographed documents on his old flip phone during lunch breaks, sitting alone at the same bench he ate 10,000 lunches on, glancing up every few seconds like a man who knew exactly what he was risking. He mailed physical copies, wrapped in plastic and rubber banded by year, to a locked storage unit he rented 40 minutes away under Eleanor's maiden name, a detail so quietly sentimental it made Grace's throat tighten the first time she learned it. And twice a year, without fail, on Eleanor's birthday and on the anniversary of her passing, he drove to Grace's apartment, handed her a plain manila envelope over coffee, and said only, "Just in case something happens to me, sweetheart, nowhere to look." He never told her what was inside those first 2 envelopes. He didn't need to. Grace, trained by years of quietly following numbers that didn't add up, had opened the 3rd envelope on her own initiative, and had spent the following 2 years, entirely without her father's knowledge, quietly building a case so airtight in her off hours that it needed only one final trigger to become undeniable in a court of law. Documented, provable proof of retaliatory intent, timed and dated, connecting the falsified safety records directly to a decision-maker's own words. Robert's termination, timed with such transparent, callous precision to dodge a pension payout, was that trigger. "I have everything," Robert told her quietly. "Locker 411. The blue folder taped under the shelf, and the storage unit key is still in the coffee tin above your mother's stove." "Dad," Grace said, and for the first time in years her voice cracked completely open. "You were never just protecting your pension, were you?" "I was protecting the men still standing on that floor," Robert said. "Tomas, Priya, the new kids who don't know line 4 seals are shot. I figured if they ever came for me, it'd mean they were getting nervous. Guess I was right." What followed over the next 6 weeks was not a loud cinematic explosion of revenge, but something far more powerful. The slow, inevitable weight of documented truth finally allowed to move. Grace filed an emergency whistleblower retaliation motion using her father's termination as the anchor event, which, under state law, forced immediate discovery into Harrow Industrial's personnel and safety records. She worked 20-hour days that week, fueled by gas station coffee and a controlled, quiet fury she had inherited from her father without ever fully realizing it. Cross-referencing his 3 years of photographed documents against the shell contractor's public filings, against Dwayne's buried incident report, against 17 personnel files that all shared one suspicious date pattern nobody at corporate had ever expected an outsider, let alone a state investigator, to notice. Once state investigators had legal access, Robert's 3 years of quietly gathered evidence didn't just support the case. It detonated it. Forged safety inspections, backdated to appear compliant. Falsified maintenance completions signed off by supervisors who, under formal questioning, admitted they had never physically inspected the parts in question. A shell company skimming nearly $400,000 meant for critical hydraulic seal replacements over 3 fiscal years, money that existed on paper as completed safety upgrades and nowhere else. And, most damning of all, an internal memo, written in Derek Voss's own hand and never meant to leave his desk drawer, explicitly calculating the projected savings of terminating veteran employees 1 day before pension vesting, employee by employee, name by name, ranked by proximity to their vesting date, with Robert Callahan listed first, followed by 16 other names, 6 of whom had already been quietly let go in the 18 months before Robert's own termination. Their pensions gone, their questions unanswered, their silence assumed. The Regional Labor Board, once it reviewed the timeline, the memo's creation date, the sudden acceleration of Robert's termination paperwork, and the near-identical language used in the 6 prior firings, did not need much convincing that the pattern was deliberate. Investigators pulled security badge logs showing Derek personally reviewing Robert's vesting date in the HR system 4 separate times in the 2 weeks before the termination meeting. A level of personal attention no operations VP had any legitimate reason to give a single line-level machinist file unless he was counting down days on purpose. The story did not stay quiet for long. A local news reporter, tipped off by an anonymous source inside the AG's office, though everyone who mattered suspected exactly who that source was, ran a segment titled, "1 Day Short, the Pension Scheme That Nearly Cost Lives." Other former employees, emboldened once they saw Robert's name attached to real consequences instead of quiet suffering, came forward with their own stories of last-minute terminations going back nearly 6 years. What Derek Voss had built as a spreadsheet optimization became, in the span of a month, a criminal fraud and workplace safety investigation involving state labor regulators, OSHA, and eventually the state attorney general's office directly, the very office Grace worked for, though she was recused from the case the moment her father's name appeared in it, replaced by a colleague who owed her exactly 0 favors and prosecuted it purely on the evidence. Derek Voss was terminated by Harrow's parent company within 3 weeks. Not out of principle, but out of panic. Once their legal team realized his written memo made the corporation itself liable for both fraud and retaliatory discharge under state whistleblower protections. He was later indicted on charges of fraud and falsifying safety records, facing the very real possibility of years in prison, not because Robert Callahan sought revenge, but because Robert Callahan simply refused to let convenience bury the truth any longer. And Robert himself? The company facing crushing liability and a labor board ruling that his termination had been unlawful retaliation timed specifically to avoid pension obligations, was ordered to reinstate his full 35-year vested pension, retroactively with interest, along with a settlement that covered every cent of Eleanor's old medical debt and then some, a number Robert quietly used without telling anyone, to pay off Grace's remaining law school loans in a single anonymous transfer she only discovered when her loan servicer sent a confused confirmation email 3 weeks later. Thomas and Priya and 11 other veteran workers who had quietly lost their own final tier pensions to the same scheme received settlements of their own, several of them calling Robert personally, some of them crying on the phone, all of them saying some version of the same thing. "We always figured you were the steady one, Cal. Turns out you were the brave one, too." The Line 4 presses were shut down for a full safety overhaul before a single seal could fail on a living hand, and young Dwayne, the 19-year-old who had nearly lost 3 fingers in the near miss nobody ever reported, was the one who personally welded the small brass plaque that now hangs above the newly refitted machine, reading simply, "In memory of the ones who spoke up before it was too late." R.C. Robert never asked for the plaque. He found out about it the same way he found out about most things that mattered on that floor. Someone mentioned it quietly over coffee, assuming he already knew. Derek Voss's indictment made the local news twice more, before quietly settling into the slower, grinding pace of the court system, the kind of case that would take another year to fully resolve. But the outcome, once the memo and the shell company records were entered into evidence, was never seriously in doubt. He faced charges of fraud and falsifying workplace safety records, exposure that carried real prison time, and, perhaps more damaging to a man who had built his entire identity around ambition, a name now permanently searchable alongside words like pension scheme and safety fraud in every future background check he would ever undergo again. On the morning it was finally, legally, completely over, Robert Callahan walked back through the same steel gate he had walked through for 35 years. Not because Harrow Industrial had begged him to return, but because his old co-workers had asked him to come collect, in person, from all of them, the gold watch the company had tried to deny him. He wore his good jacket, the one Eleanor had bought him for Grace's kindergarten graduation, still a little too tight in the shoulders after all these years, and he walked slower than he used to, not because his legs had aged, but because, for the first time in 35 years, nobody was rushing him toward a clock. Big Tomas cried this time instead of Priya, wrapping Robert in a hug that lifted him half off his feet despite Robert's protests that his back wasn't built for this nonsense anymore. The new hires who had never met him stood along the floor clapping, because word travels fast in a factory, and everyone knew exactly whose quiet 3 years of patience had likely kept every one of them from standing beside a press that could have killed them. Someone had taped a hand-painted banner above the break room door, slightly crooked, reading, "Welcome home, Cal," and Robert had to stop walking for a moment near the vending machines, one hand pressed briefly against the wall, just to collect himself before anyone noticed his eyes had gone glassy. Marcus, the young HR coordinator, who had once nervously flagged 17 names on a spreadsheet without fully understanding what it would cost them, was there too, standing a little apart from the crowd, and when Robert caught his eye, he simply nodded once, the kind of nod that forgives a young man for following orders he didn't yet have the courage to question, and welcomes him to do better next time. Marcus would later testify voluntarily against Derek's memo, without being subpoenaed. A small redemption nobody demanded of him, but one he clearly needed for himself. Grace was waiting in the parking lot just like he had always imagined, except this time it wasn't a bottle of champagne neither of them could afford. It was a folder, the original blue folder from Locker 411, now stamped "Case closed" across the front, and a small handwritten note tucked inside that read simply, "You didn't just protect me all those years, Dad. You protected everyone. I love you." Robert held that folder the way he used to hold his daughter's report cards, the way he used to hold the phone during those long, quiet Sunday calls with Eleanor before she passed, the way a man holds proof that 35 years of showing up, even when no one was watching, even when it cost him everything on the surface, had never once been wasted. He didn't get his gold watch a day early. He got it a month late, heavier than it should have been, and worth infinitely more than the company ever intended it to be. Because sometimes the world doesn't reward patience with convenience. Sometimes it makes you wait until the exact moment your quiet integrity becomes the only thing loud enough to change everything. Robert Callahan never raised his voice, never sought headlines, never wanted revenge for revenge's sake. He simply refused, for 35 years and one final phone call, to let the truth stay buried a single day longer than it had to. That evening, back on Maple Court, Robert sat on the porch step where Eleanor used to shell peas in the summer, the blue folder resting on his knee, Grace beside him with 2 mugs of coffee neither of them had touched yet. Neither of them said much. They didn't need to. The porch light flickered on automatically as the sky dimmed, the same bulb Robert had been meaning to replace for 2 years, and somehow, in that ordinary, unremarkable moment, it felt like enough. Not because justice had made things perfect, but because it had finally made things honest. Grace would later tell friends that the proudest she had ever been of her father wasn't the day the case closed or the day Derek Voss was indicted, but that quiet evening on the porch, watching a tired, steady man who had spent his whole life protecting people simply exhale, fully, for what felt like the first time in 35 years. If this story reminded you that quiet people carry the loudest kind of strength, that patience is not weakness, and that the people who show up every single day without applause are usually the ones holding the whole world together. Let this be the story you share with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you believe good things eventually find the people who never stopped doing the right thing, even when nobody was watching, make sure you're subscribed, because there are so many more stories like Robert's still waiting to be told.